Thank you to Share East for inviting me. So I'm going to talk more from an Art Fund perspective. I'm basically going to use the last sort of 20 months at Art Fund as a bit of a case study. I'm going to talk about what we did at Art Fund and what we learned, both about the sector we support, about the wonderful museums and galleries around the country, but also about ourselves as a funder. I'm going to talk about what happened, what we decided to do, what we learnt, and what might be coming next. And I think just listening to the conversation this morning, a lot of what I'm going to say echoes what's been kind of discussed and highlighted so far. And also, I don't have slides, so it's just me. But if you do want some visuals, we did publish 2 reports about what it's been like for museums through COVID-19, one earlier this year and one in 2020. And they're available on our website, but I'll also post links in the chat after I've finished talking for anyone that's interested. So I'll kick off with what happened. I think we know what happened, but I thought it might be helpful to put things in a bit of context just by explaining how Art Fund was impacted when we went into lockdown last year. So unlike a lot of trusts and foundations which have big endowments, Art Fund money comes from our membership. And we raise the majority of our unrestricted income annually through sales of the National Art Pass. So in that respect, although we are a funder and we absolutely, and the job of me and my team is to think about ourselves in the context of being a funder, we also have a business model which relies on people visiting museums, having a National Art Pass and visiting museums. And so like all of you, our business model was fundamentally challenged by COVID, and we had to kind of rebudget straight away. And a major part of that rebudgeting exercise was working out how our funding programs were going to be affected by the reduction in income. And, you know, we knew from the discussions that we were having in the weeks kind of leading up to and going into lockdown that museums, big and small, you know, faced a real and almost immediate cliff edge. And so we knew that we wanted to help. And we were lucky, and we are lucky, because although we raise our money year on year, we're also 120 years old. And we have had generations of trustees who have very carefully stewarded our reserves. And we had a current group of trustees who also understood the existential crisis that museums were facing and decided that if there was ever a rainy day, it was now, it was last year. So there was an imperative coming from both the top of our organisation and from within the team, within my team, and so we wanted to help. We've always thought of ourselves as a funder that's of and for the sector very specifically, and we were motivated to do whatever we could. So what did we decide to do? Well, I hope that you all know that over the last few years, Art Fund has been developing a range of grant programmes to support different aspects of museum practice, from curatorial research through to exhibitions and touring. But of course, in a usual year, most of our focus is on collections and acquisitions, and kind of the project-based support we gave tended to be more strategic and based more on spotting a good opportunity. And 2020 completely reversed this. It flipped it on its head. For the first time ever, as a funder, we were offering a major open project grants programme to support the museum sector in its most expansive sense, from the smallest local heritage organisations to national visual arts agencies. We knew that we wouldn't be able to provide emergency funding. We didn't have the resources or the money, or quite frankly, the skills to do that. And in any case, we had our brilliant colleagues at the Arts Council and the Heritage Fund who were doing that job. So instead, we relaunched our programme with project grants very much front and centre to support organisations, and here's this word again, to reimagine their work through the pandemic. Crucially, these project grants included covering staff costs and other core costs to ensure that they were viable and that they could be achieved. And I think some of you may know, we also made a grant to the Museum Development Network so they could also help the smallest local and volunteer-run museums to do likewise. And in fact, in 2020, we gave away well over £3 million in direct COVID support to the sector. So what did we learn? Well, I will get on to the what's of what we learned about museum and gallery priorities in a little bit. But one of the most interesting things for me now that we're finally moving out of a period, and I hope we're all starting to feel this, we're moving out of a period of simply kind of having to react and respond to the situation as we find it when we wake up in the morning, and starting to be able to reflect a little bit more on the last 20 months. So the interesting thing for me is as much as the what's have I learned, it's the how the learning has happened and what the kind of the sort of ongoing impact of how that learning has been. So I'll just describe what I mean, and hopefully it makes sense. So first of all, we've learned through consultation. So when lockdown happened in 2020, we knew, because we've been talking to other funders about the fact that we could add the most value through project funding. But in order to define the parameters of that support, we conducted a major survey of the sector, and how they were responding to COVID-19 and what the major challenges for them were. And we did that in 2020 and we did it again in 2021. And just as an aside, I say this every time I go anywhere and talk to any museum people, thank you so much for filling out those surveys, because I know that at points everyone had survey fatigue. So we are really grateful to you for taking the 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, however long it took, to actually provide us with so much kind of really thoughtful and helpful information. We've always aimed as an organisation and a funder, we've always been driven by a kind of a need to have a really deep knowledge and understanding of the sector, and we usually build relationships with the museums and galleries we fund over months and years, and we couldn't do that obviously with the situation we found ourselves in. So we had these surveys and they were on a whole different scale, and that was really interesting and important. And we found out what the sector needed. We found out, crucially, what the sector thought Art Fund very specifically could do to help. And that directly led to the launch of what we called Respond and Reimagine in 2020 and what we called Reimagine in 2021, which were our COVID response funding programs. But what those surveys also did is that, and it seems obvious now, but at the time I don't think we were thinking about it, we just wanted information. But it meant that we were able to take a much more public advocacy role than we have ever done in the past. We've always campaigned behind the scenes, but we haven't really kind of talked so openly kind of in the press before or to government before about how important it was to continue to support museums and what they needed. And the surveys provided us with the data and the authority in order to do that. And so, you know, that learning through consultation piece was important across so much more than just in, you know, designing our funding program. So the second way that we learned is we learned through doing. And what I mean is, I mean this in kind of two specific ways. The first is what we as a funder learned from running an open project grants program, which we'd never done before. And the second is how many of the museums that we ended up funding approached their applications to us for those programs. So what did we learn? Well, in 2020 and indeed this year, our funding programs have been hugely oversubscribed. In 2020, we had 451 applications. And as I said before, we're a collaborative funder. We like to work by building relationships with the organisations we support, and this just wasn't possible last year. We couldn't be available, we couldn't have those conversations, we couldn't build those relationships in the way that we like to, and that was really hard for us, and it was really hard for the team. It also meant that we couldn't support some really, really good projects. And that was also really tough, particularly at a time when there was so much need out there and so many good ideas and so much creativity. So like Safina was talking about, we also thought very hard about how we said no, whether that could be a kind of a helpful no. And we did also signpost to other funders, but both of that situation, not being able to have those conversations, not being able to support everything we wanted to, really meant that we had to think about the kind of funder we wanted to be in the future, what the practical limits of that might be. And it, left us with a lot of questions that we're still working through and we're still thinking about. Also, on a practical level, we learned we needed a new grants database because our technology was creaking. And we're going through that at the moment. And so hopefully your application experience in the future will be a lot better. We also learned about our attitude to experimentation. So as a funder, we've always been interested in new ideas and innovation across all of our programs. So we don't just fund old master pictures, we fund performance arts. And we're really interested in kind of what that means for a museum collection, for example. And through the consultation process, through that learning, we understood just how much that attitude was valued by the sector. And then through our COVID-19 response funding, we learned further like how comfortable we were with funding experimentation, because COVID was an opportunity in that respect. It was born out of necessity in many cases, born out of crisis, but it was an opportunity to experiment. And most of the projects that we've supported through our COVID funding really have that in common, whether the actual focus of the work has been digital engagement or tech infrastructure or education programs, or new ways to reach local communities, or new ways to welcome audiences back into your buildings. All of them have very kind of clearly asked what it means for that organisation, very particularly to be in a period of existential crisis. And all of those applications have also understood that, despite the huge challenge, perhaps because of the huge challenge, now is the time to think about how to do things differently. Now, the other important thing is that none of those applications, and certainly as a funder, we didn't know either if everything that was proposed in those applications, in those projects, was going to be successful. But the point was that it was a moment to try stuff. And so if you don't know if it's going to be successful, the critical thing, of course, is to build in how you learn from what you're experimenting with, how you learn from what you're trying. It's about knowing how you will learn as much as it's about knowing how you're going to define what might make it successful, if that makes sense. And so I guess this could be described as the third how of kind of the learning that I was talking about, and that's learning through evaluation, and that seems really obvious. We all know, I know as a funder, as individual people who apply for funding, that evaluation is obviously baked into some degree into all funding proposals and all funded projects. But what COVID did for Art Fund is make us think about, in a different way, about what we're evaluating, why we're evaluating, and crucially, how much time and effort is required to evaluate. And what I would say for us is that we have started thinking about, how we learn through evaluation as being a much more iterative process, a much more discursive process, and there being much more responsibility on us as a funder to think about that evaluation, rather than putting all the responsibility on the organisations that we're funding. And as an example of this, so all the digital projects that we funded through COVID, this was completely new territory for almost all of us. We got so many applications for digital engagement work. We didn't know which ones were going to necessarily be successful. We didn't even know what success kind of might look like. So what we decided was much more important was to let people experiment, to learn through doing. And then for us as funder to go back and learn. So what we've just done is we've commissioned some research, and we're hoping to work with the Museums Association and some other funders to go back and look at the wealth of digital projects that were funded over the last 20 months. And to understand a little bit more about about how those went. and whether there are kind of some bigger learnings that we can have as a sector. So in that sense, we are wanting to learn alongside our grant recipients and add further value to their own projects and to kind of any sort of evaluation they're doing. So it's not all on them. So now I'll move on to just some of what we learnt. How am I doing for time? I'm terrible at timekeeping. 5 minutes. Thanks, Sally. I'll keep on going. So the first thing we learnt is, and again, it sounds really obvious, is just how important and how valuable and how loved the museum sector really is. So, as I said at the beginning, in the past, Art Fund we've kept our kind of the way we raise our money, the National Art Pass, and what we do with the money, the grant making, pretty separate. We've got one offer to the public and one offer to the museum sector. And that model broke a bit in 2020. So what we did was, throughout 2020, we ran a fundraising campaign called Together for Museums. And that was an opportunity for us to go to the public and raise money for our grant making, for that COVID-19 response funding. And it was an opportunity for us to really explore and explain to our members the way our grant programs rely on their support, but also to explain to the public what museums do and why they are important. We basically behaved like an old school charity, right? You know, there was need and we went to the public and we asked them to help us meet that need. You know, that we were able to explain that most museums are charities, and if they're not charities, then they're part of a local authority, they're a public service, and that all of them deliver really important public benefits. We all know all this, but it was an opportunity to explain it really directly to the public. And that was also something we've been able to show this year through our Museum of the Year shortlist. And all of those amazing museums on that shortlist were on that shortlist because of the work they did, the central role that they played in their local communities during COVID. And being able to have those conversations in a new way and go out and raise money in a new way was wonderful. And we ended up raising £1 million from a mix of public funding and support from other trusts and foundations to directly support that COVID programming. And yeah, we learned that the public really care about museums, that they're really important to them, and that's something we can build on, I think, as Art Fund, but also as a sector in the conversations that we have with them. So what else? Well, I suppose in other ways, we're still really in the process of learning from the last 20 months. And actually at Art Fund, we're just beginning a period of more in-depth reflection, for example, that research into the digital projects that I mentioned. And I also, like, in truth, think that we're all still in a period of transition. So that's another thing that I've learned, that we're still coming out of a period of crisis. We're actually planning to do a third survey next year. So if 2020 was about that existential crisis and 2021 was about the degree of stabilization, or maybe kind of an acceptance of the need to think more creatively about the kind of ongoing nature of the challenge, then 2020 for me is about transition and a question, you know, this sort of, are we going back to normal, quote unquote, or can we find our way to a new normal, which I think is a phrase that someone mentioned at the start. And, you know, in fact, the truth is, we still have lots more questions than answers. I don't know what normal might look like yet for our sector, but I've got some ideas, but mostly through conversation and through those surveys that we've commissioned. So our 2021 survey's dominant theme was continued uncertainty about the financial future of the sector. And I know that for many of you, funding situations are still very much up in the air, and none of us, and I include Art Fund in this, are out of the woods just quite yet. But another really strong theme was about sustainability. and what a sustainable museum sector might mean and what it might look like. And you know, for the people who responded to our survey, for the people who I talked to, for all the amazing panels that I went to at the MA conference, for all the conversations that are being had here, it can mean all sorts of things. It means being more inclusive and more diverse. It means being more environmentally conscious. It means being more focused on the well-being of your audiences, of your staff, and of your volunteers. And of course, those three things intersect in all sorts of interesting ways. It means to better use and understand the collections that we hold and that we share. And it basically fundamentally means, I think, that we think about how we grow in ways that nourish us rather than for the sake of the growth itself. And the third theme was about the sites of the museum. So, you know, if you're thinking about museum as a verb, maybe you're also thinking about, you know, where a museum might exist. And that there could be three equally important sites. So on sites in the building, online, our digital offer, and out in the community. And that those three sites of practice could support and inform each other. Now that's a lot, right? That is a lot for museums and funders to work out together about, and about, you know, what that means for the sector, about what that means for how we plan, about what that means for how we generate income. So I think perhaps the thing that I've really learned through this is that we have to work together to reimagine a more sustainable future for the sector. And for me, as the director of programs at Art Fund, what role Art Fund can play specifically to help make that happen. So what next? Very quickly, well, that's what we're going to spend our time doing. So we'll still be offering our usual support across acquisitions, across research grants, as well as project grants, hopefully for a third year. Watch this space. We'll still be offering our free crowd fundraising platform, Art Happens, our free museum ticketing platform, Art Tickets. And I suspect a major focus across a lot of what we do will be on audience engagement and development. So helping you to continue to encourage audiences back and build on the brilliant work that you've all done to engage them through the pandemic. And also consider how collections, the museum profession and museum audiences can move towards greater inclusion and diversity. But alongside this, we will be evaluating, researching, reflecting, and most importantly, listening to all of you to make sure that what we have learned over the last 20 months, we don't forget it, and that it continues to have a really positive impact on what we do in the future. Thanks, that's it.